Hello everyone. Today we are going to speak about the Najdorf variation in the Sicilian opening. This is actually the first part of a 3-video course I'm going to do for PowerPlayChess. And before actually starting, what is the Najdorf variation after all? Well, this is actually a very fashionable line in the Sicilian, which is characterized by the following position you have now on your screen after the 5th move of black, a6. Of course, this is within the realm of the Sicilian opening, which contains many different lines, and we can safely say that the Najdorf variation has established itself throughout the years, even the decades, as perhaps the most fashionable of all. It's been played regularly by perhaps the 2 greatest players of all times, Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov, who, without a doubt, considered the Najdorf as their main weapon against e4. Nowadays, you have great players having taken up the Najdorf in their repertoires as their main weapon. I think the best advocate nowadays is clearly Maxime Vachier-Lagrave from France, but other top players regularly employ the Najdorf variation at the highest level. Vichy Anand, for instance, Fabiano Caruana, Anish Giri, and many others. The reason why it is so fashionable is that the Najdorf actually offers a good mix between sound, strategic ideas and, of course, a good amount of concrete lines which can be worked out in advance by top players in their opening laboratory. So basically for us, let's say, lesser player, mortals, it actually is also a good way to try to play. Basically, you can play the Najdorf by knowing its main ideas. Of course, you need to get a certain amount of concrete knowledge, but actually the Najdorf can be played reasonably at any level. You don't need to be an absolute top player for that. Now, perhaps just let's point out an etymological question. Why is it called the Najdorf variation? Well, clearly it's named after Miguel Najdorf, the Polish-born grandmaster who emigrated to Argentina during the Olympiad just before the first, on the eve of the World War II. And well, actually, he was not the inventor of the idea. He was not the inventor of the opening. He did employ it regularly. But I would say that perhaps the very first player who actually used the Najdorf in its spirit, let's say, was Opocensky, Karel Opocensky, a Czechoslovak player who held a little bit earlier than Najdorf. So he started playing it in the 30s, 40s, and actually quite really in the spirit of the Najdorf, as we are going to explain it a little bit later with a few moves and variations. But Najdorf clearly employed it as well. And I have to say that in those times, openings were given names a little bit like this. You got a top player employing an opening once, so they would name it after him. Think, for instance, of the Alekhine defense against e4. The Najdorf is an example. The Nimzo-Indian was not invented by Nimzowitsch either. And later it also became trendy to give names according to top players. Another example could be the Petrosian variation in the Queen's Indian, which was not played for the first time by Petrosian either, and so on and so forth. Anyway, this is the Najdorf variation. Actually, when you hear this name, it has this sound, and you really know what it is about. But let's actually come back to the very first moves of the game without entering, of course, too many details. I think it's important to try and get the idea of why we play the Najdorf with black? Oh, Najdorf players employ this. Why is it? Which alternatives are there? And basically when we start the game with e4, which we can actually claim as the perhaps most natural move which white has at his disposal on move 1, because it enables the development of the knight, the bishop on f1, and basically you can castle within just a few moves, which is very natural. You want to develop your pieces, try to control the center, and castle, put your king into security as soon as possible. Black can play many moves. Usually he tries to fight for the center in some ways. It can be e5, of course. It can be the French, it can be the Caro-Kann. Basically, what white wants to do, if he could play a second move in a row, he would like to play d4, establish a nice pawn center here with the pawn duo on e4 and d4. And black can choose to allow this, like as in the French or the Pierz or Caro-Kann. But of course he can challenge this idea by e7, e5, or with the Sicilian move c5, which is basically meant to exchange here on d4 as soon as a white pawn is going to appear here. White has many possible reactions to the Sicilian, of course. We are going to take a look at the open Sicilian, which invites then the Najdorf. Of course, you can play the closed Sicilian with knight c3. You can play the Alapin with c3, and there are various other ideas which are a little bit different in spirit than the open Sicilian, which is clearly the main challenge. I think we can say it quite safely, to play knight f3 in order to try and play d4 and recapture with the knight here. Here again, black has various moves at his disposal. He can play e6, knight c6, or d6. Basically what black has to do is obviously to develop his pieces. Contrary to all the lines with e5 on move 1, black is going to experience a little more difficulties to develop his king side quickly, especially since the bishop cannot move yet, the knight g8 hasn't moved yet. So it's going to take a little bit more time to do this, which means the king may stay a little longer in the center. And here we can already try to define a few guidelines on how both players are going to fare in the opening battle, which is for white clearly to try and develop quickly and perhaps attempt to launch an attack against the king, which may remain in the center, the black king again, or if it castles, then perhaps to try and anticipate an attack. Well, clearly, again, the main move is to try and open the center with d4. When black takes on d4, we take back with the knight, although taking back with the queen is possible too. And after taking with the knight, you can see that white's pieces can develop freely. Both bishops have open diagonals. The knight b1 can develop as well very quickly, obviously. And for white, it's going to be easy to castle pretty quickly, as we said, contrary perhaps to black, who now plays knight f6, hitting e4. And I think it's perhaps the good time to claim already now that the pawn on e4 is usually a slightly soft spot for white when facing the Sicilian, which means black is going to try and attempt to put some pressure on this pawn. It depends, of course, a little bit on how white is going to develop further. He can choose to overprotect this pawn with f3 at some point here or later. But what he wants to do generally, as I mentioned before, is to try and launch an offensive on the black king. And this usually goes together with f4, which does not contribute, on the contrary, to protecting e4. Well, now white plays knight c3. And since we were speaking about the pawn on e4, perhaps let's waste a few sentences on pawn structure, because the Sicilian pawn structure is very typical. We have, after just a few moves, two pawns away from the board. the d pawn of white has been exchanged against the c pawn of black with c takes d4. This is actually reminiscent of all pawn structures like hedgehog, maroxy, with the difference, of course, that in the Sicilian the pawn here remains on c2, is not on c4. But general guidelines remain more or less the same. Each camp has a semi-open file, the d file for white. Let me highlight it with an arrow, and the c file for black. Clearly, both camps are going to try and use this open file to put some pressure with the rooks on the enemy camp. For white, he's going to attempt to put some pressure on the d pawn on d6. He may try to use the outpost on d5, depending on how black is going to react in the few next moves, whereas black is going to try and use his c file to launch some sort of attack. He can also use his pawn minority on the queen side to launch a minority attack, sort of, with perhaps a6 and b5 at some point. Well, here again, on move 5, black's path can diverge, and he can play either g6, this is the famous dragon variation, which is actually very sound from the point of view of pawn structures, since d6 remains well protected, and black can develop quite freely and hope to get a very sound position. The only problem, if I can say, with the dragon is that white usually manages to launch a rather strong attack against the king, which is going to castle short side, with bishop e3, queen d2, f3 is coming, and then bishop h6 at some point, h4, and so on. And black players don't always feel too comfortable against such an attack, even though objectively the dragon is certainly playable. The main question for black, if he decides against the dragon, will be then what to do with the e-pawn, whether to go to e6 or to push two squares with the e5, because he wants to develop the bishop f8, of course, to e7. And before making or taking this decision, black can also choose to play a rather useful waiting move like a6 in the Najdorf, as again, there are other moves possible. e6 can be played immediately, knight c6 as well, but a6 is the flexible Najdorf move, which prevents, first of all, a check on b5, which could be unpleasant if black plays e5 immediately, prevents also a knight sortie to b5 in case d6 would be a sensitive spot at some point. So basically a useful move, and as said, later perhaps b5 is going to come. So a6 is a useful waiting move, and black actually here can choose whether to play e6 on the next move or e5. Now e6, let's say after a normal developing move like bishop e2, e6 would actually lead to what we call the Scheveningen setup, where pawns are basically placed on the 6th rank. You can see a6, d6 and e6. Black is going to develop with bishop e7, castle short. If possible, he is going to play b5, and in case of a4, he might only have to play b6. So basically a very solid position, very reminiscent again of the hedgehog setup for black here. Very flexible, a little bit lacking space, but basically this is the Scheveningen setup, which was definitely preferred by Garry Kasparov. I can think, for instance, of his matches, World Championship matches against Karpov, where he employed the Scheveningen often. And not only these matches, of course, but we can recall many great victories by the 13th world champion. The other possibility is actually the real Najdorf move. It's to try and play e5 on move 6. This has pros and cons. On the first hand, on the one hand, with e5, black definitely takes some space in the center, wins a tempo by attacking the knight on d4. The bishop on c8 can develop a little further. It can go to e6. Black can also choose to flank it or the bishop to b7 in some lines. The drawback of this, let's admit now, knight b3, which is the classical main move in this position, the drawback is clear. Positionally speaking, the square d5 has been weakened, and this is also typical of some other Sicilian lines, as the Sveshnikov, for instance, or the Kalashnikov. We're basically in the same sort of pawn structure, with a few differences, of course. But this point d5, this square, which is a strong outpost for white, is clearly a positional strength for the first player, for white. But again, black is going to try and compensate by dynamic factors, which we are going to discuss in the other two videos which I have prepared for you for PowerPlayChess. Note that, of course, we have only looked at bishop e2 now, but there are many moves for white here. You can imagine other very sensible developing moves like bishop e3, when black actually tries to play e5. He can also choose to play e6, but I will actually look rather at e5, the typical Najdorf setup, whenever possible. That is also after a move like h3, strange looking move at first sight, but a move which has a point, which we are going to look at certainly in the second video, and the third as well. There are many moves where actually black can play e5 without real discomfort. However, there are two moves. Those are bishop c4 and bishop g5, where e5 is clearly not recommended because white on his sixth move has played something clearly directed against e5. When playing bishop g5, now let's admit the knight just goes somewhere. Could be b3 or f3, doesn't really matter. The bishop has immediately pinned the knight on f6, which allows a very quick control and firm control of that square d5. Positionally speaking, not ideal clearly for black, and not what we want to get. So after bishop g5, we have to play e6. And this is going to be a topic for next video. The same with bishop c4. Here the pressure on this diagonal is pretty strong, so it would be unwise to play e5 because that bishop would be really strong, pushing against f7, contributing as well to controlling d5 here again. So that wouldn't be so good for black, and here clearly e6 is the best and the main move. Well, I think that's it for a short introduction. Again, I will try to cover mostly the Najdorf type of positions which go with bishop e3 and e5, and this is what I have done recently in a DVD for ChessBase, which has been released quite recently in the past few moves. It's a DVD you can either purchase and get concretely, I mean in a real box, or you can also download the file from the ChessBase website. In the next two videos, I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into details, presenting basically the repertoire I'm offering on the DVD, and also make some sort of discussion on how top players consider the Najdorf nowadays for either side. So I hope you will certainly enjoy those two videos as well. Thanks a lot and see you soon.